Today I'm going to be showing you my preferred architecture and tech stack for an Android mobile native application. So this is actually a precursor video to an Android app building crash course that I'm going to be putting together. And these are the things we're going to be using in it. So if we sort of separate this, moving upwards in green with our front end components or our UI components, our user interface components, the things that the user interacts with, versus the blue stuff, which is more towards the back end, like your persistence layer and those kinds of things. What we see is in the front end side, the UI side, right at the top, we'll have an activity. In this case, I prefer to have just like one main activity, and then I like to work with fragments, which are basically sub-activities. An activity is almost like a page or a screen within Android, and you can reuse fragments and whatnot within different activities, and I like to kind of swap them in and out. And these have different XML layout files. Then we want to separate concerns. We don't want much logic within our activities or our fragments, our kind of UI components. That's what the view model is for. It's there for actually accessing data from repositories and those sorts of things and passing them through to the activity. And we'll do that through something called live data, which is basically an observable. It's similar to your kind of like RX, Java, reactive style of programming. So these view models will interact with repositories. They won't actually interact with external data sources or internal data sources directly. That's hidden behind a repository. The view model just accesses data through repositories. And the repository in turn will decide where it's going to get the data from, either from like an external data source using something like retrofit, which is what we'll be using, and we use retrofit to make HTTP calls to an external web service, or the repository could access the data from an internal data store like an offline cache, and we'll be using Room to put together an offline cache. And Room is basically almost like an ORM. It's like a layer on top of an actual data store or database, in this case a SQLite database. So Room is similar. It's like an object relational mapping kind of thing. It's similar to Hibernate and JPA, like those kinds of things, but there are some differences. Back to the front end, like I said, we'll have multiple fragments there, like fragment 2, fragment 3, etc., etc. And we are going to be using the navigation stuff from Android Jetpack. A couple of the things that I mentioned already, like Room and live data, also from Jetpack. And yeah, this navigation stuff makes it really easy to define actions and effectively like paths between different fragments. When a user clicks on this, show this fragment, etc., etc. And each fragment to us will almost be like a page. So Android Jetpack flies into the mix, and it provides us with a lot of the tools. It's basically a suite of tools and guidelines and things to use for architecting your Android applications. And some of these tools, it works really well with Kotlin. So Kotlin's going to be my language of choice for this crash course. And it provides things like Room for your persistence, navigation, which I mentioned previously, as well as live data, which I also mentioned previously, those observables. The difference between live data and normal observables is that they are aware of life cycle. And then all of this is part of Android X. So wherever you see a package called Android X, you're working with Jetpack. So let's just summarize before we end off. So the IDE I'm going to be using is Android Studio. The programming language I'm going to be using is Kotlin. We're going to also be using Android Jetpack, which provides us with a suite of really nice features and tools that we can use. Data binding, I think, is part of it as well, at least data binding with live data, because you can bind it directly. Navigation, Room, and a bunch of other things. There's a whole bunch of stuff in Jetpack. We won't even be using all of the things. And then we're also going to be using material stuff, both in terms of like the kind of design paradigm, but also the material components actually provided within the Android libraries. So there's like material themes and stuff like that you can use directly. And yeah, the architecture that we'll be using is the one I showed you with the view model and all that kind of stuff, and that's called MVVM, or Model View Model. So that's what we're going to be using. So thanks very much for watching this video. I hope you learned something, and I hope you keep watching the Android Crash Course series, and please subscribe to my channel if you want to see more videos like this.